I need to tell you something that's going to sound absolutely insane. I've been carrying this with me for 3 years now, and honestly, I don't care if you think I'm crazy. I've already been through that whole process of questioning my own sanity, going to doctors, trying to convince myself it was all some elaborate dream or hallucination, but it wasn't. What happened to me on that October night changed everything I thought I knew about our place in the universe and about what's really going on above our heads while we sleep. This story sounds impossible, but every detail is burned into my memory. If experiences like this fascinate you, make sure to like and subscribe for more incredible stories you've never heard before. Before I dive into this, let me give you some context about who I am. My name is Anna. I'm 34 years old, and I'm an architect. I'm not some UFO conspiracy theorist. I wasn't obsessed with aliens or science fiction. I work with facts, with data, with structures I can measure and prove. I've always been skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by science or logic. When people talked about paranormal experiences or UFO sightings, I'd roll my eyes and think they needed psychiatric help. I live in rural Montana, about 40 miles outside of Billings. It's the kind of place where you can see the entire night sky without any light pollution, where silence is actually silent, and where your nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. I bought this property specifically because I wanted to get away from the chaos of city life. I wanted peace, quiet, and solitude. I had no idea that this isolation would make me a perfect target. The night it happened was October 15th. I remember the date so clearly because it was my ex-husband's birthday and I'd spent most of the evening feeling sorry for myself. We'd been divorced for about a year, and despite everything that had gone wrong between us, I still missed him sometimes. I'd had a few beers, maybe more than a few, and I was sitting on my back porch around midnight just staring up at the stars and wallowing in my own self-pity. That's when I first noticed the light. At first, I thought it was just a really bright star or maybe Venus. But as I watched it, I realized it was moving. Not like a satellite or an airplane though. This thing was moving in ways that defied physics. It would hover completely still for several minutes, then suddenly dart to the left or right at impossible speeds, then stop again like it had never moved at all. I sat there watching this thing for what felt like 20 minutes, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of military aircraft I'd never heard of. Maybe it was a weather balloon caught in weird wind currents. But deep down, I knew I was grasping at straws. This wasn't anything I could explain away. That's when the light started moving toward me. I don't mean it drifted in my general direction. I mean it came straight at my house like it knew exactly where I was. As it got closer, I could see that it wasn't just a light. It was a craft of some kind, disc-shaped, maybe 40 or 50 feet across. The whole thing was glowing with this soft, pulsing white light that didn't seem to be coming from any specific source. It was like the entire hull was luminescent. I should have run inside. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to move, to hide, to do something, but I couldn't. I literally could not move my body. I was frozen in that chair, watching this thing descend into my backyard. The air around me started to feel thick, almost electric. My skin was tingling, and I could taste metal in my mouth. The craft landed about 30 yards from my porch, settling down without making a sound. Not even the whisper of displaced air. It just landed. The ground didn't shake. There was no impact. It was like watching something that weighed nothing at all come to rest on my property. For several minutes, nothing happened. The craft just sat there, pulsing with that weird light. I was still paralyzed in my chair, but my mind was racing. Part of me was terrified, but another part was fascinated. I mean, if this was really happening, I was witnessing the most significant event in human history, right? Then a section of the craft's hull simply disappeared. Not like a door opening, but like the metal just dissolved away, leaving a perfectly rectangular opening. Light spilled out, but it was different from the glow coming off the hull. This light was harsher, more clinical, like the fluorescent lights in a hospital operating room. 3 figures emerged from the opening. I want to be really clear about what I saw because I've replayed this scene in my head thousands of times over the past 3 years. These weren't the classic gray aliens you see in movies. These beings were tall, maybe 7 feet, and incredibly thin. Their skin looked like it was made of some kind of smooth, dark material. Not black exactly, but a deep gray-blue color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their heads were proportionally larger than a human's, but not grotesquely so. What struck me most were their eyes. They were huge, taking up maybe a third of their faces, and they were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye. Looking into them was like staring into deep space. They moved toward me with this fluid, gliding motion. I still couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The closest one stopped about 10 feet from my porch and just looked at me, and I swear I could feel something probing around inside my head. Not painfully, but it was definitely there, like someone was gently pushing through my thoughts, examining them. Then, without any visible communication between them, all three beings moved toward me simultaneously. The paralysis finally broke, but it was too late. I tried to stand up and run, but my legs gave out immediately. It was like they'd been asleep for hours. I collapsed onto the porch deck, crawling desperately toward my back door. I never made it. One of the beings reached out and touched my shoulder with what I can only describe as a hand, though it had 6 fingers instead of 5. The moment that thing made contact with me, everything went white. Not just visually, but every sense I had was overwhelmed with this pure, clean whiteness. The next thing I remember, I was standing inside their craft. The interior was nothing like what you'd expect from the outside. It wasn't cramped or mechanical. The space was vast, way bigger than the craft could have possibly contained based on its exterior dimensions. The walls, floor, and ceiling all seemed to be made of the same smooth, luminescent material. There were no visible seams or joints anywhere. It was like the entire space had been carved out of a single piece of some unknown substance. And it was warm, not hot, but perfectly, comfortably warm. The air smelled clean, almost sterile, but with a faint metallic undertone that reminded me of the taste I'd had in my mouth back on the porch. I was in what I can only call the main chamber. There were maybe a dozen of those tall beings moving around, but they weren't paying any attention to me. They seemed to be working on various tasks at these stations that grew right out of the floor. The stations didn't have any buttons or screens that I could see. The beings would just touch different areas of the surface, and patterns of light would flow across them. But here's where the story gets really terrifying. I realized I couldn't leave. I don't mean I was being held prisoner exactly. No one was guarding me or preventing me from moving around. But every time I tried to approach what I thought might be an exit, I would find myself walking in a different direction without realizing it. It was like the space itself was subtly redirecting my movement. I tried to approach one of the beings to communicate, to ask what was happening, but the same thing occurred. I would walk toward one of them, and somehow I'd end up on the other side of the chamber. It wasn't teleportation. I could remember taking each step, but the steps never took me where I intended to go. After what felt like hours of this, I started to panic. Really panic. I was screaming, demanding to be let go, pounding on the walls. The beings completely ignored me. They didn't even look in my direction. It was like I didn't exist to them. That's when I noticed the other humans. In the far corner of the chamber, there were 3 people sitting on what looked like benches that grew out of the floor. 2 men and a woman, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s. They were just sitting there, staring straight ahead with these blank expressions on their faces. I managed to approach them, and when I got close, I could see that their eyes were open, but they didn't respond to me at all. I waved my hand in front of their faces, snapped my fingers, even shook one of them gently by the shoulder. Nothing. They were alive. Definitely breathing, but it was like they were in some kind of trance. One of the tall beings finally approached me, not walking exactly, but gliding across the floor without any visible leg movement. It stopped directly in front of me, and those massive black eyes fixed on mine, and then it spoke to me, not with words, but directly into my mind. The voice, if you can call it that, was completely neutral. No emotion, no inflection. It simply said, "You are not ready for return." I tried to respond, to ask what that meant, but I couldn't form coherent thoughts. It was like my mind was full of static. The being continued. Time, adjustment, required. Memory integration necessary. Physical adaptation in progress. Physical adaptation. Those words sent ice through my veins. The being gestured toward one of the wall stations, and a section of the surface became transparent. Through it, I could see outside the craft, but we weren't on my property anymore. We weren't even on Earth. Below us was a planet I'd never seen before. The surface was covered in these massive geometric structures that stretched as far as I could see. They weren't buildings exactly, but these crystalline formations that pulsed with the same light as the craft. And in the distance, there were other ships. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all similar to the one I was on. Where are we? I managed to think clearly enough to form the question. Transport hub. Processing station. Your species designation, subjects requiring gradual introduction protocol. The implications of what it was telling me started to sink in. This wasn't just an abduction. I was being processed, like cattle, and those other humans sitting in that trance-like state. They'd been here longer than I had, maybe much longer. I asked how long I'd been there, and the response chilled me to the bone. Your linear time measurement, 47 days. 47 days. I'd been missing for 47 days, but it had only felt like a few hours to me. What was happening to time? What were they doing to my perception of reality? The being continued to communicate, explaining that humans were being collected for what it called evolutionary acceleration. They were taking people from all over Earth, studying us, modifying us somehow, and then returning us. But not immediately. First, we had to be prepared for reintegration into human society. The knowledge you have gained must be filtered. Direct transmission would cause psychological fracture in your species. I demanded to know what knowledge they meant, what they were doing to us, why they were keeping us here, but the being just repeated, "You are not ready for return." Over the following days or weeks, I was subjected to various procedures. I was taken to different chambers within the craft, each one serving a different purpose. In one, I was laid on a table that molded itself to my body while beams of light scanned every inch of me. I could feel the light penetrating my skin, examining my organs, mapping every cell. In another chamber, they did something to my brain. I was conscious the entire time, watching as they inserted these incredibly thin filaments into my skull. There was no pain, but I could feel them moving around inside my head, touching different areas. During this procedure, my entire life flashed before my eyes, but not in sequence. Random memories from childhood, from last week, from years ago, all jumbled together like someone was shuffling through the files of my mind. But the worst part wasn't the procedures. It was the waiting. Hours upon hours of sitting in that main chamber, watching the beings go about their tasks, listening to their incomprehensible communications, feeling like a specimen in a lab. The other humans never came out of their trance. I tried talking to them every day, but they never responded. Sometimes new people would appear, and others would disappear. The woman I'd first seen was gone one day, replaced by an elderly man who had the same blank stare. I started to wonder if I was going crazy, if this was all some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by a mental breakdown. But everything was too consistent, too detailed. The taste of the air, the texture of the walls, the specific way the light moved across the surfaces. You can't hallucinate that level of detail for weeks on end. Finally, after what the beings told me was 3 months, they said I was ready for return. The preparation involved what they called memory adjustment. They explained that my conscious recollection of the experience would be altered to prevent psychological damage. I begged them not to do it. I wanted to remember. I needed to remember. But they said it was necessary for my survival. Human minds, they explained, weren't designed to process certain types of experiences. Direct memories of extended time in their environment would cause permanent psychological fracture. The last thing I remember clearly from the craft was being back in that main chamber, watching as one of the beings approached with what looked like a crystalline rod. It touched the rod to my forehead and everything began to fade. I woke up on my back porch, sitting in the same chair I'd been in when I first saw their craft. My first thought was that I'd fallen asleep outside and had the most vivid dream of my life, but when I checked my phone, it was December 8th. Almost 2 months after that October night. 2 months that I couldn't account for. I stumbled inside and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked exactly the same as I had before, but I felt different. Wrong somehow, like I was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Over the following days, fragments of memories started coming back. Little pieces of the experience that had somehow survived their memory adjustment. The taste of the air on their ship, the feeling of those filaments in my brain, the sight of that alien planet below us. I went to the hospital and demanded a full physical exam. The doctor found nothing unusual, but I insisted on MRI scans, blood work, everything. The only thing they found was a small scar behind my right ear that I'd never had before. It was perfectly circular, about the size of a pencil eraser, and it had healed so completely that the doctor said it must have been from childhood. But I knew it wasn't. I also found that my property had been perfectly maintained during my absence. The grass was cut. The mail had been collected. Even my bills had been paid from my bank account. When I called my employer to explain my absence, they told me I'd been on approved vacation. When I insisted I'd never requested vacation time, they showed me documentation with my signature approving the time off. Someone or something had managed my life while I was gone, making sure my disappearance wouldn't be noticed. The psychological impact of this experience has been devastating. I've been to therapists, psychiatrists, sleep specialists. Some think I had a psychotic break. Others believe I experienced some kind of dissociative episode brought on by depression over my divorce. One doctor suggested I might have been drugged and suffered from anterograde amnesia, forgetting 2 months of my life. But none of those explanations account for the details I remember, the perfect consistency of the memories that survived their adjustment, the physical evidence of the scar, the inexplicable management of my life during my absence. What haunts me most is what they told me about evolutionary acceleration. The implication that they're changing us, preparing us for something, and I have this terrible suspicion that I'm not the same person I was before they took me. 3 years have passed since that October night, and I am fundamentally different from the person I was before. The changes aren't immediately visible to others, but I feel them every single day. It's like living in a body and mind that are almost mine, but not quite. My thought processes have shifted in ways I can't fully explain. I find myself approaching architectural problems with solutions that seem to come from nowhere. Complex structural calculations that I solve intuitively before I can work through them logically. My designs have taken on geometries and proportions that feel eerily familiar, yet I know I've never seen them in any human architecture. My dreams are filled with building techniques and spatial concepts that don't exist on Earth, yet somehow feel perfectly natural. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the night sky with a longing I can't name. Not homesickness for Earth, but for somewhere else entirely. A place I can barely remember but miss desperately. The worst part is the isolation. How do you explain to friends and family that you feel like you're slowly becoming someone else? That you wake up some mornings and need a moment to remember which planet you're on? The physical changes are subtle but undeniable. That scar behind my ear sometimes tingles, especially on clear nights when the stars are brightest. I've developed an almost supernatural awareness of electromagnetic fields. I can sense when my phone is about to ring, when electronic devices are malfunctioning. My sleep patterns have completely changed. I need less rest but dream more vividly, always of places and beings that feel more real than my waking life. Sometimes I catch myself knowing things I shouldn't know. Technical information about physics or structural engineering that I never studied. I'll be working on an architectural project and suddenly have the solution without understanding how I arrived at it. My dreams are filled with images of technology I've never seen, of places that don't exist on Earth. And sometimes, late at night when I'm sitting on that same back porch, I find myself looking up at the stars and feeling homesick. Not for Earth, but for somewhere else. Somewhere I can barely remember but somehow know intimately. The hardest part is knowing that most people will never believe me. How can you explain that you were held captive on an alien spacecraft for months when you can't provide concrete proof? How do you describe the feeling of having your memories surgically altered by beings from another world? But I'm telling my story anyway because I think people deserve to know what's happening. We're not alone in the universe, and we're not being left alone by those who share it with us. They're taking us, studying us, changing us in ways we don't fully understand. And if my experience taught me anything, it's that they're not done with us yet. Whatever they're preparing us for, whatever this evolutionary acceleration means, it's still happening. Right now, while you're reading this, there are probably people being taken from their homes, their lives temporarily suspended while they're processed in ways that will change them forever. I don't sleep well anymore. Every time I hear an unusual sound outside, every time I see a light in the sky that moves strangely, I wonder if they're coming back for me. Because that being told me something else during my captivity, something I've only recently begun to remember. It said, "Integration successful candidates will receive secondary processing upon planetary preparation completion." I think I was just the first phase, and I'm terrified to find out what comes next. That scar behind my ear sometimes itches at night, and I swear I can feel something moving under the skin, something they left behind, some kind of marker or device that lets them know where I am at all times. I'm being watched, and the worst part is, sometimes I find myself hoping they'll come back, because despite the terror, despite the violation of being taken against my will, that place felt more real than anything I've experienced on Earth. The knowledge they gave me, the glimpses of technology and consciousness beyond human understanding, have left me feeling like I'm living in a pale shadow of true reality. I'm not the same person who sat on that porch 3 years ago. I've been shown too much, changed too fundamentally to ever truly fit back into the world I came from. And I think that might be exactly what they intended.